Hi, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, giving you another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek podcast family of presentations. Thanks for joining us today, or joining me. So I'm glad to have you along. Today's topic is I wanted to talk about how you can organize and talk about your control methods. As we get more and more clients who are becoming increasingly educated about wildlife and wildlife control. I'm not suggesting that they're educated about wildlife in the sense that they want to do the work themselves, but they're getting more educated about wildlife in the sense that they're looking for alternatives than simply a trap and kill solution. Now, some of you, of course, are trapping animals and translocating them somewhere else. And you notice how I didn't use the word relocation, because I define relocation as moving an animal within its home range. Translocation is moving an animal outside of its home range. So most of your clients don't want it relocated. They want the animal translocated. And that's a whole ethical, biological, scientific issue that we're not going to talk about today. What I wanted to mention, though, is that when a client is pushing back, let's say you make a recommendation to a client about a particular control method to solve a particular problem, and the client sort of balks at that. One of the strategies you can do is simply go through this mental checklist so that you understand and go through all the potential options for management of this particular problem that the client is having. So without this mental checklist, you may be doing it automatically, but this gives you a structure to organize that information. So you can explain to the client, hey, we went here are all of your options. Tell me which one you want me to use. I'll give you my recommendations as to which one are going to work, or to give you the success that you're looking for. But if you're going to restrain my ability to do something here, well, then at least you'll know that this was an educated choice. And I think that's an important point for you as wildlife control operators, including you as pest control operators, is you need to be giving your clients what we call informed choice. It's not just simply, yeah, we're going to fix it. Well, some of your clients that may be fine for them. They don't care, right? But increasingly, you're going to be encountering clients who want all the details. They may be a little naggy. They may be a little bit too hyper. They may be really sucking up your time. I hope you're charging enough, but the reality is you've got to have a strategy and an organizing principle to explain to them what the options are, which ones that you like and which ones that you don't like, but at least the client's going to be able to make an informed decision. So I wanted to go that. By the way, this list is not mine. I didn't come up with this list. I didn't invent it. This came from my former boss, Dr. Scott Hingstrom. He was formerly of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Now he's up at Stevens Point, University of Wisconsin. So this is something where it may not even be his, but I learned it from him and learned it from Prevention Control of Wildlife Damage. It's a way of organizing all of the control methods. And so I wanted to kind of introduce that to you. So hopefully you could incorporate this in your own business. And I'm going to just encourage you to memorize it. Just learn it. It's not that much. Some of you may intuitively understand it. I'm going to try to explain it for you. Follow it, and it can become very helpful in terms of your organizing all the information, the diverse information that we have in wildlife control, so we can begin to start talking the same language. So one of the issues that I'm certainly passionate about is if our industry doesn't start developing standardized talking points, standardized ways of communicating, we're not going to have the political impact that we need to have. We need to be able to speak coherently and logically so that when I say something, you understand exactly what I'm referring to, which is probably a podcast for another time, or a podcast in this case. So why don't we turn over now to the PowerPoint, the mini PowerPoint I've created. And I want to just go over organizing wildlife control methods for you as a wildlife control operator, as well as pest control operator. So why don't we get started with that? So one of the things that you want to look at here is this is how the control methods are organized. Again, we're not looking at the biology of the animal. We're not looking at the life history of the animal, how many young it has. This is simply your client says, I have X. I want it gone. How can we go about doing that? And so this is where all the control methods that are going to be brought to bear, they would fall into one of these categories. All right, so I'm going to try to explain them. Let me just sort of list them first, and then I'm going to try to explain them a little bit so you have an understanding of what they're referring to. Okay, so number one, we have what's called habitat modification. That includes cultural controls, and we'll talk about that shortly. The second one is exclusion. The third one is frightening devices. The fourth one is repellents. And then it turns to shooting, trapping, toxicants, and biological. So all the control methods that we have to control vertebrate pests, and again, I'm primarily focusing here on vertebrate pests. I'm not referring to insects here, although much of insect control methods can fall under this as well, but they have the pest control world breaks this up just slightly differently, but they're analogous. So this is the structure we use for vertebrate pests. Let me go through that list again. It's habitat modification, exclusion, frightening devices, repellents, shooting, trapping, toxicants, biological. Now, there is a logic to the order of these particular methods. Okay, that's why you see them in two different colors here. I have a green section and I have a red section. Now, this is simplistic, and I have published an article on this, and that I think this is too simplistic. However, it's unfortunately a lot of people believe that it's true. It's not, but it is mostly true. And one of the things I try to explain to people when we try to do education, one of the obligations of an instructor is they have to lie to their students, which is a bit harsh to say it that way. It's not quite true. They'll call it a lie, but we'll just say it just to kind of get a little shock value there. You kind of lie to your students because if you overwhelm them with too much information, they can't process it all. So you have to sort of chunk the information, simplify things beyond what they actually are in order for the student to be able to begin the knowledge. Okay, so what is that arbitrary term here? The arbitrary term is non-lethal, lethal. Okay, so the green section is called non-lethal. It won't kill the animal. Not completely true, by the way. And then you have lethal. Okay, so I argue that it's actually more complicated than that. But again, we're getting a little far afield here. I don't want to complicate this more than it already is. But as a general rule, the green area is non-lethal in the sense that you're not directly killing an animal. Now, the animal may still die, but it dies for other reasons. You're not taking it and bonking it on the head or shooting it or something, okay? Whereas the shooting, trapping, toxicants, biological often are lethal. Now, I know you can trap an animal and translocate it. Again, this is a simplified version here, and so I want to be sure you understand that. Non-lethal, lethal. That's why they're organized in this particular manner. So when a client asks you, hey, what can I do to get rid of these voles on my property? You're going to say, all right, is there habitat modification? Can exclusion be done? Frightening devices be done? Repellents, can that be done? Shooting, trapping, toxicants, and biological. All right, so why don't I take a little moment now and break this down so that you understand what each element is. So when you're explaining it to your client, you know exactly what we're referring to. What do we mean by habitat modification? Habitat modification refers to the living conditions that allow that animal to live. You may have had clients tell you, I don't know why this squirrel is here. Well, the bottom line is the squirrel is there because the environment in that location allows the squirrel to be there. Think of it this way. A fish needs water. No water, no fish. You don't find fish in the middle of the desert. Okay? Plain and simple. If there's no water, there's no fish. So if you want to get rid of fish, get rid of the water. That's plain and simple. The same thing happens with a lot of other animals. For example, with voles. If you have voles on your property, voles are sometimes called meadow mice with people. They often live in grasslands. One of the ways is simply plow under the grass, glyphosate the field, so you kill all the grass or plow it all under, and your voles will pretty much disappear. No food, no voles. Okay. Now, is it drastic? Absolutely, it's drastic. Okay. So if you scorch earth the area where nothing can live, that's pretty drastic, but it is an option. I tell people when I was back in Massachusetts where we had moles, people would say, I want a permanent solution to control moles. And my answer would be pave your lawn. Get asphalt out there, put concrete over it. If you do all that, there is not going to be any issue with moles on your grass. Moles do not live under concrete. That's simple. Okay, now, is that something I want people to do? No, I don't want them to do that, but it is an option. You can do that. So that is a form of habitat modification. Most habitat modification, however, is more subtle than that. Things like closing the trash cans, modifying bird feeders that isn't spilling food all over the ground. Okay, I have a publication on that. You can Google that. Okay, those are simple things. Making sure the dog and cat food's picked up, or maybe you're not feeding animals outside to begin with. Okay, making sure your trash cans are secure. Maybe you're picking up the acorns and apples before they're reaching the ground. Okay, those are all examples of habitat modification. You are changing the conditions that allow those animals to thrive. You may say, well, Stephen, it's not going to work. Yes, it may not always work because you're not able to control all the habitat. But what people don't understand is that sometimes even marginal changes can impact how well other techniques are going to work. So yeah, if you cut your grass and your neighbor doesn't, you're going to have the issue of voles coming over to your lawn, even though your neighbor, even if you cut your grass. However, if you don't cut your grass, the problem is just going to get worse. All right. So some of these things are subtle. I tell people all the time when we're talking about habitat modification, small changes can have big impacts, even though they're small. Okay, because they can amplify other control methods. All right. So that's habitat modification. Now, a subset of habitat modification is what's called cultural controls. Cultural controls is typically used in farming communities where the producer or the farmer is changing their practices. Maybe they're planting the crops a couple weeks early so that the plants are tall before the migratory birds come across. Okay, or you plant the crops a few weeks later so that the plants aren't there when the migratory birds go across. That would be a form of cultural control. Sometimes the type of plant that you put down makes a difference with how attractive the plant is to certain animals. For example, Canada geese, which some of you may be struggling with now. Canada geese like certain types of grass better than other types of grass. So if you change the type of grass you're growing, that's a cultural modification. It's also part of habitat. You've changed the habitat to make it less palatable for those Canada geese. Now, they'll still probably hold their nose and eat it, right? But the point is that it makes it more difficult for them. And so therefore, think of it like if you're getting irritated by something and you're hungry, let's say you're going to a restaurant and you're like, the music's really loud and you hate the music and you're like, I'm hungry, you're going to persevere. But are you really going to want to go back the next time? Well, that's what you're kind of doing with an animal when you're changing that habitat and you're making their life a little bit harder. When you do something else, that's going to make a change in their behavior and it could magnify. I hope that's clear for you. Frightening devices are things that do not require, that are not what's called chemicals. So they're not a pesticide. So repellents are considered pesticides. So frightening devices rely on sound, light, combination, or there's a biological component, like a hawk flying overhead. All right, that would be a biological frightening device, even though it's a living organism. Okay, as long as the hawk's not killing the birds, it would be a frightening device. So frightening devices use non-chemical means to scare those animals away from unwanted areas. And so typically visual, they come at the visual method, the auditory method. There's what's called biological acoustical, where you're relying on a biological sound to evoke a fear response. And then there's a combination, like, for example, pyrotechnics relies on a visual and a sound because it explodes, which has a light component and a sound component. And then you have the biological. So visual, auditory, a combination of the two, and then biological. Those are your frightening devices. Repellents rely on a chemical that either the animal ingests or smells or has some sort of tactile component to it that causes the animal to avoid an area where you don't want that animal to be. So methylphenolate is something you can fog to get birds out of a particular area. Methylphenolate is something you can spray on grass to keep Canada geese from feeding on it. There are other products out there. Not many. A lot of products are sold as repellents. One of the challenges with repellents with vertebrates is that it washes off, it wears out. Sometimes the animal, if the animal's hungry enough, they're just going to plow through and eat it no matter what. So, but that's still a repellent, and sometimes you're able to get some marginal effort, marginal control in certain areas. So, for example, typically repellents work better when your neighbor doesn't use the repellent, but you do. And so the deer go over to the neighbor's yard to feed. But once the food's gone, don't be surprised if the deer come back. Nevertheless, it's still a repellent. Shooting, now we're getting into the lethal control. Shooting's pretty straightforward. You have an offending animal or an offending species, you shoot the animal, it's dead. Okay? Plain and simple. There are different ways you're shooting. You have sharpshooters, you have opportunistic shooting, you have guided shooting, and then you have traditional hunting seasons. Those are the types of shooting opportunities. Okay, so shooting is pretty straightforward, and it covers a wide variety of projectiles. Trapping, again, a wide variety of tools used for trapping. Typically, the animals are killed after they're trapping, but not always. But trapping is certainly an option. These are mechanical means, for those of you PCOs, mechanical means of getting the animal to die. Then you have stuff known as toxicants. Okay, so toxicants, I'm going to break this down into two parts. You have regulated toxicants and non-regulated toxicants. So there's a new category coming up in our industry, non-regulated products like carbon monoxide devices or propane oxygen exploders. You know, how you want to define those. We could put them under toxicants even though they're not regulated by the EPA. Nevertheless, typically toxicants tend to be baits or fumigants. So either the animal's eating it and it dies of the poison, or they breathe the poison and that kills them as well. So toxicants tend to be regulated by the EPA, although we have a new category coming along now where you have non-regulated type products. Carbon monoxide devices, okay, the Burrow RXs or the Cheetah or the pressurized exhaust rodent control, and you have the propane oxygen exploders. Those are the rodentinators, and I think there's a gofinator out there as well, where it takes a mixture of propane and oxygen, injects it down into the burrow, and then you detonate it. It's pretty cool. I've written about that as well. The last category is we're going to call biological. Biological is where you are using either a disease or an insect or some sort of a predatory animal to drive away or kill the animal you don't want. For example, a lot of people think, because there's so much mythology in our country, okay, a lot of people, like I call it Santa Claus talk, right? They think cats control mice. Okay, they don't. But they think they do. And so they have all these cats roaming around. And cats are just ravaging the countryside because they're killing all the birds, and they're killing the snakes, and they're killing the frogs, and killing everything else. They're proof that Americans hate the environment. Okay, but I digress. But biological cats would be one example of a biological, not a very good example, but it's a biological. So that's probably the simplest way that I can explain that biological form for you. Those of you that have raptors, and you're able to have hawks, and you have a hawk that will go over an area and kill some birds, that would also be a biological form of control. Okay, so I hope that that outline kind of lays that out for you. We have habitat modification, exclusion, frightening devices, repellents, shooting, trapping, toxicants, and biological. And in toxicants, I'm throwing in those unregulated products as well, although you could make another category out of that. You'll notice those of you who are able to see the video are able to see 2 arrows. Now, why are those arrows there? As a general rule, as you go down the list, the price decreases. You may think, well, Stephen, repellents aren't that expensive. They are when you consider the need that you have to continue to reapply them. Habitat modification, to do it over broad areas, can be quite expensive, which is why most people don't do it. And the reason why most of us in our businesses don't think much about habitat modification, other than really minimal things, is because it's hard to get an entire neighborhood to control, to trench screen all of their areas to prevent skunks from getting in. All right, that would be a form of exclusion, where you're putting a barrier up to prevent the animal from causing offending activity. That's expensive. Okay, now the beauty of exclusion is it's permanent, right? I mean, you're paying a lot of money, you're putting up the bird netting, that's a form of exclusion, you're putting on the chimney cap. There may be a high cost initially, but when you think about the benefits over time, the price drops precipitously. The problem is this is a psychological element in the long run. You may think, well, why aren't people spending for the long run? Well, the reason is, in the long run, we're all dead. That's why. So you do the same thing. You'll not repair something because you'll think, well, I'll just wear it out and buy a new one, rather than trying to fix it because of the cost of the fixing it. It's not worth it when you consider the cost of replacement. Okay, we all do this, even though we may complain about our clients not willing to spend the money. So as you go down the list, the cost tends to decrease. There are exceptions, of course, but as a rule, they tend to decrease. The area on the right shows the arrow going up. In other words, the higher up the list you go, the more humane the method is perceived to be. Now, I've argued that it's not necessarily more humane. It could be more humane, but it's not always more humane. But I don't want to cloud this issue too much. But as a rule, your clients will think habitat modification is less offensive to them, or exclusion is less offensive to them in terms of you're not killing anything, and put that in scare quotes there. You're not killing anything directly, and they think that is more humane. Okay, so that is something you would have to keep in your back of your mind. Why is this important? I'd have clients saying, I don't kill anything. Okay, well then, here's what we're going to have to do. If you don't want me to trap those squirrels and kill them, then I will need to harden your house and install one-way doors to allow those squirrels to leave but not re-enter the structure. And understand there may be a situation where the tree squirrel may gnaw elsewhere into the building and cause new damage. Now, I don't want to create fear out there. I think a lot of wildlife control operators don't use one-way doors enough. I don't think they rely it, partly because they lack confidence in it. However, let's assume you're dealing with a brick house. Okay, with a brick house, what's the likelihood that you could make that house hard enough, protect enough of the vents, and then install a one-way door to keep a squirrel out. Let's call it a flying squirrel, which have very small jaws, not much gnawing power. Could you do it? I hope you could. It's not that hard. I've done it. Okay, and I can assure you, if I can do it, you can do it. All right, so it's not that hard. So that would be a form of quote-unquote non-lethal control of flying squirrels, where we actually harden the building and exclude them out of the structure. One-way door, they're just, we kick them out and lock the door. Those of you that do bat jobs and you're doing one-way doors on bat jobs, that's in a form of exclusion, right? You're hardening the house, installing the one-way doors, the bats leave, they can't get back in. Voila, the problem is solved, right? So as a rule, as you go down the list, the price gets less. As you go up the list, the cost gets more. I hope that you will find this structure, this way of organizing your control methods helpful, because you need to be able to explain to your client what methods can possibly work and what methods can. So you can literally go down the list with your client and say, do you want to do this? This is what that's going to cost. Do you want to do this? This is what that's going to cost. This is the likelihood of this working. And that way you're having an informed client, so the client understands, all right, ma'am, you wanted to try repellents. Repellents are a pesticide. You have to have a pesticide license to apply them typically, although there are some states there are exceptions. But as a rule, you understand that this may only give you a temporary reprieve. Okay? If your client understands that, then you can probably build someone where you could derive a tremendous amount of recurring revenue off that client. Or you could probably get a dealer's license and sell the product directly to them, teach them how to do it, and if you're not looking to do that as part of your business model. So let's go over that list one more time, okay? We have habitat modification, which I'm including cultural controls. Exclusion is the second category. Frightening devices, repellents, shooting, trapping, toxicants, and intoxicants. I'm adding in those unregulated devices, which would be propane oxygen exploders and carbon monoxide devices, and then, of course, biological controls. Why? Another thing that you may find helpful with this is I organize my photos partly based on this. I use a habitat modification folder. I use a repellent folder in which I include frightening devices together, and then I have a shooting folder, trapping folder, and then a toxicants folder. And so I'm able to organize my photos in terms of my control methods. I also have a biology photo for the animal and a damage identification photo for this particular species. So for raccoon, I'll have a folder that says raccoon, and inside raccoon I will have biology, damage identification, habitat modification or exclusion, repellents, which will also include frightening devices, shooting, trapping folders individually, and then I'll have, if I get too many trapping techniques, I may break it down into cage trap and other traps as well. So it's a way of organizing your photos so you always know where to find them, because one of the challenges I find with people in wildlife control is they may take photos, which is certainly a blessing, they just can't find them anymore. You need to have a way of organizing your material so that you can find your photos and use them to help support your business and hopefully the industry as well. Certainly people like me are always looking for photos that can be used for training, because you guys are out in the trenches doing that type of work and you come across some pretty cool stuff. If you have some photos to sell, I'm always looking for wildlife damage photos. I'm looking to come up with edition 4 of the Wildlife Damage Inspection Handbook. It's not imminent, but I'm always looking to improve that. Reach out to me. Hey, finishing up here, I'm Stephen Vantassel, Wildlife Control Consultant. Living the wildlife. I'm hoping that you'll live the wildlife so that you won't be the wildlife. We don't want to have that happen. You have a product that you'd like to have reviewed, send it along to me. Go to wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Reach out to me. You have a show idea that you're wanting to have done, reach out to me, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. And we're always looking for sponsors to help keep this show going as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. Reach out to me again, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you, comments, criticisms. We want to know that we're making an impact for your life and improving your business and your safety and your family so that you can be better at what you're doing and start living the wild life. I'm Stephen Vantassel. Hey, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.